So my sermon title is Mi Casa Yo. Anybody know Spanish? Yeah? We got a couple in here. I have no idea. I don't know Spanish at all. But I'm in love with Spanish worship music. And so I've got a whole playlist. And I have no clue what they're saying. It's fantastic. But for me, it's kind of helpful because I generally know like the sound of it. So like when I'm going on a run or I'm working out or something like that, I like know generally what the song is because they're singing like one that's in English. But I don't know the words, so it lets me get into kind of a heart set of meditation while I'm not getting necessarily drawn into the words. So it lets God kind of take my brain where he wants it for a second, which has really kind of been a fun experience. What's also fun, though, is that Chrissy does speak Spanish, so I'm learning what in the world I'm listening to, right? And so the other night we were sitting down, and I turned on my Spanish playlist, and this song came out. Like, this is just my favorite song, and Mi Casa Yo, and I'm like, what does that mean? You know? She's like, well, it's more like a turn of phrase. It's not necessarily like a perfect, you couldn't really translate it perfectly. It's more a colloquialism within Spanish where it says, my home is your home. What's mine is yours. And I just love that. I'm like, something you can't really put into words, right? It's more of a picture than it is a phrase. And Mi Casa Yo. And that's how the song goes. It says, Mi Casa Yo, Mi Casa. God, what is mine is yours. My heart, my home is yours. I don't want there to be a difference. When I get to heaven, I don't want to be shocked. Right? Mi Casa Yo. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, this is our main text for the day. And there's quite a few in there. You're going to see in the sermon notes, I did a little bit different than Thomas does. I put footnotes in there so we don't necessarily get distracted because there's tons of scripture. And that is for your research for this week. But the main passage comes out of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 10, and you can say 10 to 17. Okay, verse 10 to 17 is really the entirety of the passage. But starting off in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 10, it says, because of God's grace to me, I have laid the foundation like an expert builder. Now others are building on it, but whoever is building on this foundation, they must build with care. To build with care. What does that mean? What does it mean to care? You know, they say in counseling offices, what is unworkable is apathy. You can work with anger. You can work with annoyed. You can work with sad and depressed, but you can't work with apathy. And when you start to see a home break down because that husband or that wife is just done, it's when whatever was anger carries on for too long. The bridge collapses. Apathy sets in, and the separation is too great to ever bridge again. Apathy. What does it mean to care? He's saying, I want you to build with care. To go back and ask, do the details matter? As I look into my heart and my home, what should be non-negotiable here? Do we have an answer for that? And so I started off with the question, if I was able to ask your kids, or I was able to ask your spouse, or I was able to ask someone close to you, how would you define this person's home, your parents' home? What would they say? What would be the words to describe it? I asked Joe and Selah last night. Asking a 6-year-old for that is not helpful. I was given literally nothing. Chrissy and I are both trying to. At some point, we're feeding them the answers, and we're like, it's not fair. They were just like, it's amazing. Yes, Joa. No, so finally they came up with our mommy and daddy in our rooms. That's what we love about our home. I'm like, okay, I can work with that. I'm not going to try to make a big connection, okay? But for yourself, all right? Like the goal of these notes is that you take this week. I try to build it into kind of a devotional guide you can work with. It doesn't have you just looking up verses, all right? So take some time this week and ask yourself, God, search me and know me. What is my home? What am I about here? What am I building? For those closest to me, what would they say am I about? If they had to replace my name tag with one attribute of who I am, what would they put? Is it busy? Is it successful? Okay. In what? Why are we busy? Mi casa yo? Question? What would they say? What does it mean to build with care? And so the two, I think, just kind of encapsulating questions I want to wrestle with today, and the ones that I've been wrestling with now for a while, is does God actually care about building a home? And if God built a home, what would it be like? First of all, does he actually care about building a home? I'm not going to read through all these passages. You see, there's a couple there. You can spend your time this week, and I just want to put the map there for you, and you can see that God is a homebody, and he's a home builder. He's been doing this from the very beginning. In the garden, he created, and in 7 days, he built not a place for Adam and Eve, but a place he could walk with them and be present with them. We just prayed it. Heaven to earth. There's not supposed to be a gap. We made the gap. The separation came because of our sin, that we broke our covenant with God. And we decided, as we looked in the middle of the garden, there were two trees. There was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, which will one day be in Revelations, this beautiful bookend to the story of God. But we looked at it and we go, tree of life, tree of, right? And that's kind of every day the challenge that we have. We get to choose. Do I want to serve the living and loving God and live into the abundant life that he has for me, the John 10:10, full, abundant, overflowing life? Or do I want to compromise like Sean was preaching last week? And do I want to give in because of the trials? And do I want to submit to the temptations and find myself in a place of less than? God built this place, and he meant himself to dwell there with us. And what was crazy about it was Adam and Eve, the minute they broke it, they go and they cover themselves, and God goes, who told you you were naked? And all of a sudden, there's not this separation. That's what the clothing is. I'm not saying we all need to come to church naked next week. I'm saying, like, Thomas would be shocked. All right, but not in the notes. Yeah, okay, so, but this is this idea later on in Scripture that we're supposed to be naked before God. It's a metaphor of this idea that one day we will be completely, there will not be anything separating once again. And this is supposed to be transcendent all the way down through the ark, where he puts his people back in this place so they can be started over. He builds this ark, and it is tedious. And it is a lot of detail. And he's like, you build it this way, otherwise it ain't gonna work. And so Noah was, of all things, what? Faithful. And then it goes to the tabernacle. Then it goes to the temple. And this is the ultimate representation then of heaven. And then this is transcended then onto the earth, where we see the expression of the temple and heaven, and it's supposed to find itself working out in the church and ultimately us. And you can see this at the very end of our passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, read the rest of this with me. Verse 11. So build with care, verse 11, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one we already have, Jesus Christ. What's the foundation? It is Christ. Anyone who builds on that foundation may use a variety of materials, gold, silver, and jewels, wood, hay, or straw. But on the judgment day, fire will reveal what kind of work each builder has done. Is it something that lasts? Faith, hope, and love, the only things that last, the gold standard, don't be settling for anything else? Or are we building with hay, wood, and stubble? Submitting what we view as success for God's standards, and God's going, nope, you settled. Here it is, verse 3 or 13. But on the judgment day, fire will reveal what kind of work each builder has done. The fire will show if a person's work has any value. If the work survives, that builder will receive a reward. But if the work is burned up, the builder will suffer great loss. The builder will be saved, but like someone barely escaping through a wall of flames. Listen to this, verse 16 and 17. Don't you realize that all of you together are the temple of God, and the Spirit of God lives in you? God will destroy anyone who destroys this temple, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. Those are strong words. We're supposed to make a very specific connection that the temple, as it was expressed in the Old Testament, which was the place of God's dwelling symbolically, is meant to be who? Us. Individually, the church was not given the Spirit of God. We were. And we are to be built up, Ephesians chapter 2, into his holy temple where his Spirit might dwell. In other words, people who are like, you know what, I got God, I don't need people, you're lying too. We're built on the foundation of Jesus, leaning together to create the temple of God. In other words, you are, yes, a part of the temple. You are like a stone that is building the temple. So when you pull a temple stone out, I could say, is that the temple? Yeah, because if I start pulling too many stones out, what happens? If the temple decides, you know what, I don't want to lean into the other stones, I want to lean away from the other stones, what happens? So we are supposed to be grounded and founded on the foundation that is Jesus Christ and his truth, but we are also supposed to be leaning together into other believers, building into this temple, but it starts also with you. And that's why this is not a sermon for the married. This is a sermon for the human. Because if you are unhealthy and you're leaning away, the whole thing is compromised. We all hurt. He's saying, if you destroy this temple, God is not happy about it. Because this was the whole point. It was a home. It wasn't some sort of science project. God was like, let's see what happens. No. The design is intricate and intimate. It's a reflection of who he is in the world. And as we see the creation over 7 days, and then we see this idea of 7 speeches that result ultimately in the tabernacle and in the temple and this intricacy that's slowly built into the church, we see that God is like, hey, be very careful here. I'm building something. I care about what I'm building. Because this is a place for what? My presence. And God cannot dwell where his presence cannot be. Maybe this is even harder one. He will not dwell where his presence is not welcome. You know, God can work with us being a mess, but he can't work with apathy. He's saying, if you don't care, this won't work. It all starts, though, with my presence. I want you guys to see 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 10 through 11. This, I think, is one of the coolest. This is actually the dedication of the temple. by Solomon. So King David wanted to build the temple. Chapter 5 talks about he was not going to build the temple because he had made some pretty bad decisions, Bathsheba, okay? And so he's told later on, you're not going to do this, but one of your sons will. Solomon is that man, the man of great wisdom, also the man, like his father, of a lot of issues. And ultimately, he self-destructs. But he did follow in his father's path, which was King David, to go and build that temple. And it says when he's dedicating the temple, verse 10, chapter 8, when the priests came out of the holy place, a thick cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not continue their service because the cloud, the glory and the presence of the Lord filled the temple. Do y'all see the visual? Right? Imagine if Thomas walked in here and he's got his 97 pages of sermon notes. He spent all week preparing, right? And we are all here to sit at the feet of the master, right? And so we're like, teach us, Thomas. And then it's like, the cloud comes down, and Thomas and I are both getting pushed out by the cloud. It's like, but the sermon notes, and God's like, it's not about the sermon notes, right? And so there's two very important things I think about the presence of God that we need to really wrestle with and try to digest. And the first is this, is that it was a visible thing that happened in the temple. And I don't think this is all just some sort of metaphor when it comes to the New Testament, when we see what is this thing we're supposed to be building today. He's saying the presence of the Lord in your life should be a visible thing. People should see when the present is here and the present is here, when the presence of God is here, it should be visible. When was the last time someone complimented you for the presence of God in your life? Right? And when you wake up in the morning, what is the goal? I always remember people would say mean things, and my mom would say, Cameron, when people open their mouth, it's just a window to their soul. So I'd be like, ain't going in there. And when we do, the question is like, what are they seeing inside? Is the presence of God visible? But also, not as just is it visible and palpable, but is it disruptive enough to change your day? The priests had every intent of following through with the dedication. They're like, God, this is the dedication. Why are you pushing us out? He's like, because I'm here. I get it. Thanks, guys. This is what this is about. And there's many of us, I think, that we're not necessarily willing to be disrupted. We're happy to walk into God's temple and kind of take what we need and then leave out, but we're not necessarily willing to be God's temple and let him come in and push us out. And that is a hard thought when it comes to church, where consumerism has somehow found its way into the psyche of everyone, right? I mean, like, if we're all being honest, we all see things a little bit that way. We just do. Like, I hear all the time, I didn't really get anything from that, but I'm sure Susan would have. Thanks for the sermon. I'll pass it on to Susan. Like, why did you come to church today? We always talk about it's to meet with Jesus, the presence of God. What does that mean? Is it disrupting your world, or is there room for something else? There's a very scary passage, and I wrote it down here. You guys can put it in the margins there. It's Matthew chapter 12. Starts off with Jesus. He's doing things on the Sabbath he's not supposed to be doing, like healing people and being nice. And so people are calling him out for this kind of stuff. And finally, one of them says, are you a spirit of Satan? And Jesus looks at him and he goes, I do wonder what's going on. He's probably just like, no. He said, a house divided against itself will not stand, was his metaphor. I cannot be working for Satan and for God at the same time. So as I'm casting out demons, I'm not a demon doing it. And then right at the end of that same chapter, he gives the very example of some guy, some demon-possessed individual who cleaned it up, who came to church, who spent the time, who did the work, who found the presence of the Lord. And it says that he cleaned up his heart and he kicked out the demons. But he didn't do anything with it. He got lazy. He got content in maybe an unhealthy way. And it says that this demon went and he got his buddies. And they came back and they made it twice as bad as it ever was before, because when they got there, they're like, hey, look, they cleaned it up. Let's wreak havoc. And they took residence in this individual and made it twice as bad. And this house did not stand. What are we making room for? As we consider ourselves as being the temple of God, what are we making room for? What do we need to clean out and say no more? Because Satan isn't kidding around. This is a battleground that we have in our home, in our heart, and he's saying, what are you making room for? Ultimately, the question is whose name is on the deed? What I love about 1 Kings, you guys go back to that. You can actually just look down at the bottom of your margin, in your notes if you want, real quickly. You're going to see that there are two very different types of building in the Old Testament. There's this one that's going on with the temple. Chapter 8, verse 17. A couple of verses later from what we just read about the filling of the temple, it says, then Solomon said, my father David wanted to build this temple to honor what? The name of the Lord. And if you're looking for that one, it's on the very front page. Chapter 8, verse 17, to honor the name of the Lord. Verse 18, but the Lord told him, you wanted to build the temple to honor my name. Your intention is good, but you are not the one to do it. Your son's going to do it. The difference is you guys ever heard of the Tower of Babel? These people set off to build something as well. What was their goal? To reach God. To work together and reach God. Terrible goals, aren't they? Many of us, we think, okay, what do I want to do in my life? And this is, I really think, unfortunately, the Tower of Babel is finding itself being resurrected in 2023, where people are saying, you know what, we need to stop being so divisive. We need to work together with the goal of something. And in the church, I think it's to reach God. But is that the goal? God revealed their hearts when you look back into Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. It says that they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face. It was self-preservation, building a name for themselves. And so on the top of that tower was supposed to be their name versus the tower in the temple that was being built, which is the name of God. You see the difference? This is a very specific difference. And God was very clear which one of those was going to stand. And so at the name of your house, the deed of your home, what would you say that is? We're taking a little bit of time here to wrestle with this idea of what are we making room for, and in the end, what is ours and what is not. Because that should change the ultimate objectives of your life and of your family. Whose name? Listen to this. Matthew 18, verse 20 is a passage that I think is misused so many times. For where two or three are gathered, there am I with them. And we think that when we get together, and this is really about us having conflict with each other, said, when I'm having conflict, when two or three are gathered in what? He's saying, if you want to enjoy my presence, you better make sure I'm there. God doesn't just show up because it's got a cross on it. And so we need to be very, very careful how we build and what we build. I remember years and years and years ago, my pop-pop, who's passed away, he was kind of a big beacon of me of faith in my life. Him and his wife were medical missionaries in Africa for like 40 years and just gave their life to being Christian missionaries. And when I was young, he came and stayed with us in Houston for a while, and he wanted to build a actual, like, if you will, scaled down version of the tabernacle. And so we went detail by detail an entire summer, and we built this tabernacle. It was about the size of this stage. And we slowed it, and it took forever. And you can imagine, I'm a very patient person. And we're sitting there gluing, like, each little thing. And about halfway through, I looked at him and I said, Pop, this is taking forever. Like, come on. Won't people get it? Like, give me a juice box, I'm done. And Pop looks at me and he goes, yes, it is. It's a lot of work. It's very specific, but that's the point. That's the point. Think about these Israelites as they're in the desert and they're having to resurrect this thing back up every time they set camp so that God's presence will come and dwell in the middle of the camp. And then as they move along, they break it down, take up what is the Ark of the Covenant, they move, and they take all this time, they build it back up, and then they set up camp so that God's presence will dwell. Think about, you think any of them are sitting there like, give me a juice box? Like, I got it, God. You got it. It's important. The concept doesn't change in our lives. The details really do matter. Because if we start getting distracted by all the other things, the things God really wants in our home will not exist. And so what are those three things? There's so many, but I think we can really summarize it by three. The first is this. It is the practice, look at your notes, of what? Peace. The second is the practice of prayer, and the third is the practice of peace. In the Shema, if you look back at Deuteronomy chapter 6, he says, this is what I want you to make your houses about. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Make sure that this is resting in your hearts and building in your homes. Teach it to your kids and hang it over your door frames. Make it about everything that you do when you wake up and when you go to sleep and as you're on your way. This is the purpose of your life. That is something that we hear later on in Matthew, Mark, Luke. John, he's busy doing other things. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this is what is called the greatest commandment. When Jesus is asked, what's the greatest? He says, love the Lord your God with your and then love your neighbor as yourself. Notice you start to love yourself in a healthy way when you give all your love to God, right? He reflects it back in a way that's beneficial for other people. And so he's saying, look, I'm drawing something from, this isn't new. It's not new. This isn't the Exodus. Right after he gives the 10 Commandments, he's like, hey, now one more thing, listen. I got more things to say. All right, let me summarize this for you. Boom. And then we got to take it to us. We got to say, okay, this is what we're about. Love the Lord your God with this. And God gives us a life hack where he looks at each and every one of you. He says, humans are four things. You are heart, you are mind, you are soul, and you are strength. You are heart, your relationships. Your mind, how that works or doesn't. Your soul, your spiritual essence and who you are and your identity and your strength. It's literally, we are physical. And we know that the physical isn't evil because Jesus was physical. And I believe heaven one day will be very physical. I don't think it's some sort of just metaphor in the sky. I think there's going to be an actual kingdom. Because when God reflected himself into what we understand, it was a garden. It wasn't some floating hypothesis of one. And so he's saying, hey, heart, mind, soul, and strength. When this is working together, you find shalom. This is peace. This is the overflowing version of what is wholeness in your life. Because peace is when you find everything working together as it was meant to, heart, mind, soul, and strength, not living in pieces, which is the literal word for anxiety. And most of us find ourselves pulled and tugged, not living in a place of peace. And God's like, here's the thing. When I introduced myself to the world, I said, at the burning bush, I what? Am that I am. I am present. I can't be present with you if you're not present in yourself. The practice of presence and finding yourself, God, I need to breathe and center so that I can walk with you, is so important. Because you can't enjoy the dwelling of God's presence if you are everywhere. And unfortunately, in psychology today, it's not that way. Psychologists would argue that mental health is of three things. And I was having this conversation with Chrissy, who works in this field, and he said, the literal definition of mental health is the emotional, psychological, and sociological wellness of a person. Notice the three things: emotional, psychological, and what's the next one? Sociological wellness of a person. If you want to know if someone's full and healthy, what's missing? Emotional, psychological, sociological versus what? Emotional, heart, mind, mental, psychological. What's the other two? Soul, strength. Is there one missing over here? Do you know what's missing? God. So they want to try and counsel the next generation into mental health without the one thing that actually produces it. Why are we a mess? You ever been given a puzzle without all the pieces? Light that thing on fire, man. It's so annoying. But we're giving doctorates to that now. What a nice puzzle I wonder what it means when you miss the piece. Well, you missed the piece. You guys catch it? The practice of peace. The second is the practice of prayer. Prayer is ultimately their pathway to peace. This is Philippians 4. Write that down in your margin if you want to study it later. But saying rejoice, again I say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to all. The Lord is near. So in your prayers and petitions, grant them to God, and you'll find the peace of God, which will transcend understanding. And it will guard your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus. If you want to find peace, you got to start with prayer as you're walking into the nearness of God, starting with praise. It all just works together. The presence of God and praise allows us to walk into a life of prayer, and we can all of a sudden start seeing ourselves at peace. It's this beautiful equation. God's like, I'm hacking this for you. Just read it. Do you see it? This is awesome. But if you pick me out of it, why? Why would you do that? Prayer is this idea of an uninhibited communication and understanding with God. And here's the question for us as it gets practical. Do we develop this in our home where people are really understood and sought to be understood and where we're able to actually hear each other? Or are you more like me where I'm more or less, okay, Chrissy, I can fix you. Yeah, good thought. Waiting to respond, not waiting to receive. Like there's a different type of mindset. And God is very clear when you look at Matthew chapter 7. He says, hey, when you guys start building, a good builder is one who listens to me and does it. This is the one who builds on a rock, not on the sand. He's saying when you are able to listen and receive from me good things, I'm going to help you have stability in the hard things. This is what I do. But when you don't make room for that, when my presence isn't here and prayer isn't existent, you're never going to find yourself in a place of peace. And so the question there is, how's your reception? And if you're struggling with prayer, here's my encouragement. It's less of a theory and more of a practice. So you see the quote, pray as you can, not as you can't. You're like, I can't pray for an hour. Start with a minute. I don't have time right now. Pray in your car. When you start to Invite the presence of God into your life. Things will get disrupted. Be okay with that. Wives, husbands, if you have a spouse who's trying to do that, be patient with them. Encourage that. Because this is the last one. We want to live a house of praise. What is praise? Praise is affirming what is good and true in someone. It's not some empty compliment about their new hairdo that honestly, I'm not making up anything. I love your hair, baby. All right, so it's like, but you've been there. Does this dress make, no. All right, so affirm what is good and true. And this is where you start building a house of affirmation. We start to see, as we think about the spiritual gifts, they're all about edifying and building up the church. And that's what words are as well. They're meant to build people up. Not just for anything, to build with care. It's meant to build a place where God's presence can dwell, where a person can find peace and communion with him, and then be an advocate of the affirmation of others. Right? Like this is how it works. And so God is saying, I want you to see people, and I want you to affirm what is true in them. My vow was where we can celebrate the beauty of each other's unique expression of the gospel and we abide in his unforced rhythm of grace. I don't know how to do that most days. I've told Christy, I'm not good at affirming you. She told me early on, one of my ways of receiving love is words of affirmation. I'm like, sorry. And I'm working on it. But you know what I'm really good at? I don't point out the good. I don't go out of my way to say, that's awesome, that's beautiful, thank you for that. Because that's what's already good. I'm a fixer. So I point out when it's wrong. And that's going great. She loves that. Yeah. She's like, your mental well-being's about, yeah, so what are we affirming? What are we building up? Are you someone who's known as someone who comes and builds others up? Are you building a house where God's peace is non-negotiable? Where prayer is welcome, invited, and pursued, and where affirmation and praise is just part of the recipe? Is this about your life? Because I love this one passage, and this is where I'm going to close before I talk about this behind me and get everybody out of here. Romans 12:10, love one another with brotherly affection and outdo or take preference or delight in one another in showing honor. Could you imagine if our kids were like, stop complimenting me so much. You're so sweet. I love you so much. You're the best. You're so beautiful today. God is working through. Could you imagine? And this is what our command is right here. What a beautiful challenge to build a house like that. Mi casa yo. Are we building with care? Is God welcome? Are we saying, my house is yours? I want to challenge you that this is absolutely a spiritual practice. And practices are really only become lifestyles after about 3 months. Just as we get our habits in about 3 months, so someone is diagnosed as clinical when it comes to depression and otherwise after it's been showing itself consistently for 3 months. It's a lifestyle. And so if you're in that place right now, where you're like, I think I'm clinically not okay. We have counseling. We have a group that we connect with and we support, and that's why Thomas and I try to be available and love you guys the best we can, and James and Sean, and go on the list of this is why we're here. But there's also this idea of let's practice ourselves into something new, right? And what's the next building block? And so I had our young adults in their study over the last 2 months write down every time they come together a block. And this is going to go in our new student building. So it's like generations passing down wisdom to generations, right? So as the students are in there playing this, they're going to read what the young adults have given them as their encouragement to build well. And there's so many good ones. This is what I'll close with. The reference is 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 3 through 5. You may not be able to control what comes into your mind, but you certainly can control what stays there. What a challenge. So much wisdom. What are you building? Is your home a house of peace, prayer, and praise? Father, we love you, and we ask that you would help us to walk into your home, to take a look around and ask ourselves as we walk into ours, what's wrong? What's missing? And in all of it, Father, I just ask that we would be a people that are graceful and gracious enough to see the beauty in others first, to affirm it. But I ask each person walks out today and finds you in the middle of everything they do for your glory and our good. Amen. All right, have a wonderful, wonderful Sunday. We'll see you next week. Thomas is starting his new series, How to Know and Discern What is God's Will. So you want to come for that. We'll see you next week.